There is a man from Iowa who may have done more to reduce human suffering than almost anyone else in recorded history, and most Americans couldn't tell you his name. He didn't lead an army, he didn't run for office, he never became famous in the way that phrase usually means. He spent his life in dusty fields, breeding wheat, and because of that work, because of seeds he developed in Mexico, tested in South Asia, and pushed into the world against every obstacle thrown his way, hundreds of millions of people who were on a path towards starvation instead lived long enough to have children and grandchildren. Some estimates suggest the ripple effect of his work touched the lives of over 1 billion people. 1 billion. From one man. From one farm boy out of Cresco, Iowa. His name was Norman Borlaug, and if you've never heard it, that's exactly the problem this video is here to fix. I want to be honest with you about something right from the start. This is one of those stories where the more you learn, the more you feel a kind of low-grade outrage, not at anything political, not at any particular enemy, but at the simple fact that this story isn't told more. It's not in most history textbooks at the level it deserves. It doesn't come up in the conversation about the greatest Americans of the 20th century the way it should. And yet when you look at the scale of what Norman Borlaug accomplished, a scale that can be measured in human lives, it's hard to argue that anyone born in this country in the past 100 years did more concrete good for the world. So let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what he did, you have to understand where he started. Norman Ernest Borlaug was born on March 25, 1914, on a small farm near the little community of Saudi, just outside Cresco in northeastern Iowa. If you've never been to that part of Iowa, picture rolling farmland, cold winters, and the kind of rural life that in the early 20th century meant rising before dawn, doing physical work from childhood, and attending a one-room schoolhouse. That's where Borlaug started. And I always find it worth sitting with that for a moment, because so many of America's most important stories begin exactly here, not in the corridors of power, not in Ivy League universities, in the dirt, in small towns, and the kind of upbringing that teaches you, without ever using the word, that you do what needs to be done. He made his way to the University of Minnesota in 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression. He nearly didn't stay. There are accounts of him being broke, homesick, ready to quit. And this is where we have to mention a man named Dave Bartelma. Bartelma was Borlaug's wrestling coach at Minnesota. The team called him Gopher Dave. And by multiple accounts, it was Bartelma who talked Borlaug into staying when he was on the verge of going home. Borlaug wrestled competitively for Minnesota and was a capable, fierce competitor. But more than the sport, what he took from Bartelma was a philosophy. You don't quit. You stay in the fight. You push through. If that sounds simple, consider how often it's the simple things that determine whether a person becomes what they were capable of becoming. It was at Minnesota that Borlaug discovered plant pathology, the science of plant disease. And the person most responsible for that discovery was a man named Elvin Charles Stockman, one of the most respected plant scientists in the country at the time. Stockman had spent years studying a devastating fungal enemy called stem rust, scientifically known as Puccinia graminis, and Borlaug would later say that attending one of Stockman's lectures changed the entire direction of his life. Stem rust is exactly what it sounds like, a fungus that attacks the stems of cereal plants, particularly wheat. It spreads through the air as spores. It can move across entire regions in days when conditions are right. And when it hits, it doesn't just damage a crop, it destroys it. Whole fields gone. That kind of destruction across the scale of a country's wheat supply means one thing: hunger, on a massive scale. Borlaug earned his bachelor's, master's, and eventually his doctorate, all from the University of Minnesota, all in plant pathology and genetics. By the time World War II was drawing to a close, he was a trained scientist with a deep understanding of plant disease and a restless need to apply what he knew to a real problem in the real world. That opportunity came in 1944, when he was recruited to join a new agricultural initiative in Mexico, a joint program between the Mexican government and the Rockefeller Foundation, focused on a problem that was getting desperate. Mexico didn't grow enough wheat to feed itself. Think about what that means for a moment. Mexico in the mid-1940s was a net importer of wheat. It was buying grain it couldn't produce, which made it vulnerable in ways that went beyond economics. Stem rust was part of the reason. The disease regularly tore through Mexican wheat fields before harvests could be completed. But the underlying problem was that the wheat varieties being grown simply weren't productive enough. Yields were low. The country was falling behind its own needs. And a young plant scientist from Iowa named Norman Borlaug, who had just spent World War II working on industrial chemicals at DuPont, packed up and moved to Mexico to try to do something about it. What he found when he got there was not exactly an ideal research setup. The facilities were basic, the resources were limited, the skepticism from local farmers who'd been doing things their own way for generations was considerable. And on top of all of that, stem rust was everywhere. Borlaug later described conditions in those early years that would have driven most people home. The work wasn't glamorous, it was physically exhausting. It required patience across a timeline that was measured not in months, but in years. Because you don't breed plants quickly. Each new generation of wheat is a growing season. Each test is another year of your life. This was going to take time. He came up with something that, at the time, people thought was a little unorthodox. He called it shuttle breeding. The idea was this: instead of growing one generation of wheat per year in a single location, the standard approach, he would grow 2 generations per year in 2 completely different locations. He planted in the Yaqui Valley, in the state of Sonora, a low-altitude, irrigated desert valley in northwestern Mexico, near what is now Ciudad Obregón. Then he would take the seeds to the Toluca Valley, a high-altitude region near Mexico City, more than 8,000 feet above sea level. 2 seasons, 2 climates, 2 altitudes, 2 completely different growing environments. The agricultural establishment thought this was wrong. The conventional wisdom said you couldn't develop wheat varieties across such different conditions, that breeding in multiple environments would produce plants that weren't well adapted to anything. Borlaug disagreed, and he was right. What shuttle breeding actually produced was something far more valuable than region-specific varieties. It produced wheat that could grow almost anywhere. By developing in 2 radically different climates simultaneously, his wheat varieties became broadly adaptable. They didn't need a specific altitude or a specific temperature band. They were tough, they were flexible. And that flexibility turned out to be exactly what the world needed. But there was still the stem rust problem. To fight it, Borlaug did something elegant in its logic. He created what plant scientists call multi-line varieties, crossing dozens of different wheat strains to build in resistance. If one particular strain of rust evolved to defeat one genetic resistance mechanism, another mechanism in the multi-line would still hold. He was essentially building diversity into the wheat itself as a form of biological armor. This was painstaking work, year after year, growing season after growing season. When a new race of stem rust evolved and broke through his resistance, which happened, he went back and started again. He didn't quit. He never quit. And then came the insight that changed everything. Through contact with Orville Vogel at Washington State University, Borlaug obtained access to genetic material from a Japanese wheat variety called Norin 10. Norin 10 carried genes for something unusual. It produced short, stocky stalks instead of the tall, thin stalks of traditional wheat. Now here is why that matters, and I want to explain this clearly because it's one of those agricultural details that sounds technical but is actually profound in its implications. Traditional wheat varieties were tall. When you applied nitrogen fertilizer to try to boost grain production, what happened? The plant responded by growing even taller. And tall wheat, when it's heavy with grain, has a problem. It falls over. Farmers call this lodging, and it's catastrophic. Once the plant is on the ground, the grain is destroyed. So for generations, farmers couldn't fully exploit fertilizer on wheat. You could add nitrogen and the plant would just grow more straw, more stem, not more grain. The harvest stayed frustratingly limited. Borlaug crossed Norman genetics into his Mexican wheat varieties. The result was semi-dwarf wheat, shorter with a thicker, sturdier stem. And here is the key. When you applied fertilizer to a semi-dwarf variety, the plant didn't fall over. It stood up. It put the extra energy into grain production. The yields exploded. What had been unachievable suddenly became routine. Fields that had produced modest harvests were now producing harvests that seemed almost impossible by the old standards. By 1956, roughly 12 years after Borlaug arrived in Mexico, the country achieved something remarkable: wheat self-sufficiency. Mexico grew enough wheat to feed itself. And within a few more years, by the early 1960s, Mexico had gone from being an importer of wheat to being an exporter. The same land, the same farmers, different seeds, different agricultural knowledge, and a scientist from Iowa who refused to give up. This is the kind of thing they should teach in every school in this country. Not as a story about one man's success, but as a story about what patient, rigorous, applied science can accomplish in service of human need. But we haven't gotten to the part of the story that makes the scale truly staggering, because what happened in Mexico was, in retrospect, a rehearsal. The main event was coming, and it was going to happen on the other side of the world. By the mid-1960s, the situation in South Asia had become critical. India and Pakistan were both facing food crises of a magnitude that was genuinely alarming. 2 consecutive drought years in the mid-1960s had devastated harvests. Populations were growing rapidly. Food production was not keeping pace. Several respected analysts and demographers at the time were making serious, documented predictions of mass famine, the kind of famine measured in tens of millions of deaths. This was not alarmism. The historical record shows that the threat was real, and the governments of India and Pakistan knew it. The solution that emerged, and it emerged through a combination of scientific recommendation, political courage, and sheer logistical will, was to import Borlaug's semi-dwarf Mexican wheat varieties and plant them at scale. This sounds simple in retrospect. It was not simple. It required persuading governments, convincing skeptical farmers to try an unknown foreign seed, importing enormous quantities of grain in a very short window of time, and doing all of this against a backdrop of political instability. There is an often told detail that when the seed was being shipped to India and Pakistan in 1965, the Indo-Pakistani War broke out. The ships carrying the seed arrived in the middle of an active military conflict. The work continued anyway. Borlaug himself traveled to India and Pakistan during this period and worked directly alongside local agricultural teams. By most accounts, he was not a man who operated from behind a desk. He was in the fields. He was testing soil. He was working with farmers who were suspicious of this American scientist with his foreign seeds and his insistence that they could grow far more wheat than they ever had. The results came with a speed that stunned even people who had believed in the approach. Within just a few years, wheat production in South Asia began climbing in ways that had previously been considered nearly impossible. India, which had been producing wheat at levels that could not meet its growing population's needs, began producing harvests that broke all previous records. Within roughly a decade of adopting the new seed varieties and the associated agricultural practices, proper fertilizer use, irrigation, the country went from a state of dangerous food dependency to achieving wheat self-sufficiency. Pakistan saw similar dramatic gains. This transformation became known as the Green Revolution, and it spread far beyond India and Pakistan, into other parts of Asia, into parts of Latin America, touching agricultural systems on multiple continents. And here's the part that gets me every time I sit with this story. When the Nobel Committee awarded Norman Borlaug the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, and they gave it to him alone as the sole recipient that year, they framed it as a peace prize, deliberately. Not a science prize, not an agriculture prize, a peace prize, because the committee understood something important. Hunger is not just a humanitarian crisis. It is a driver of instability, of conflict, of the conditions that produce wars. When millions of people face starvation, societies fracture, governments fall, violence follows. What Norman Borlaug had done was not just feed people, he had removed one of the most powerful engines of human conflict from the equation for hundreds of millions of people across the developing world. The Nobel presentation speech said of him that more than any other single person of his time, he had helped provide bread for a hungry world. That was 1970. He was 56 years old. And he didn't stop. He kept working for another 4 decades. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest civilian honors the United States gives. In 2006, he received the Congressional Gold Medal, which Congress awards only rarely for extraordinary contributions to the country and humanity. Norman Borlaug is one of only a small handful of people in American history to have received all 3 of those honors: the Nobel Peace Prize, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the Congressional Gold Medal. He stands in that company not because of a speech or a political career or a famous battle, but because of wheat, because of seeds, because of decades of stubborn, unglamorous, world-changing work in dusty fields far from any camera. He died on September 12, 2009, in Dallas, Texas, of lymphoma. He was 95 years old. Right up to the end, he was still engaged with the work, still worried about global food security, still arguing that the job wasn't finished, still pushing for continued agricultural research. 95 years old and still in the fight. There is a journalist named Greg Easterbrook who wrote a piece about Borlaug in The Atlantic in 1997. He titled it "Forgotten Benefactor of Humanity." That phrase has always struck me as exactly right, not because Borlaug was entirely invisible, the Nobel Prize made sure of that, but because the scale of what he accomplished never quite made it into the popular American consciousness the way it should have. We know the names of the generals, we know the presidents, we know the pop stars and the athletes and the celebrities. And Norman Borlaug, the Iowa farm boy who may have done more to reduce human suffering in the 20th century than almost anyone else alive, is someone most Americans have never heard of. I think about why that is. I think part of it is that his story doesn't fit the templates we use to celebrate American achievement. He wasn't an inventor in the dramatic garage tinkerer sense. He wasn't a military hero in the conventional sense. He didn't make a fortune. He didn't become famous during his lifetime in the way that generates cultural staying power. He was a scientist. He worked in teams, across institutions, alongside Mexican and Indian and Pakistani scientists whose contributions also deserve recognition. He was modest about what he'd done, in a way that didn't lend itself to the kind of self-promotion that makes a person famous. And the results of his work showed up not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow, sustained reduction in hunger, something that is very hard to make a monument out of. But here's what I want you to take from this story. The thing that moves me most when I think about Norman Borlaug is this. He was not trying to be a hero. He was not trying to save 1 billion lives. He was not working with one eye on the history books. He was trying to solve a problem. He saw that people were going hungry, that a fungus was destroying crops, that existing wheat varieties weren't productive enough, and he thought, I know how to work on this. So, he went to work on it. He spent most of his adult life doing it. He didn't give up when the rust evolved to defeat his first resistance genes. He didn't give up when people told him shuttle breeding was a mistake. He didn't give up when the logistics of getting seeds into South Asia seemed nearly impossible. He just kept going, one growing season at a time, one breeding generation at a time. That is an American story. Not the only American story, and not without complexity. The Green Revolution also brought concerns about monoculture agriculture and environmental impacts that serious scholars have documented and debated, and Borlaug himself engaged with those critiques throughout his later life. But the core of the story, an ordinary kid from a small Iowa farm who developed a scientific insight that changed the trajectory of human hunger across multiple continents, that is something genuinely worth knowing, worth celebrating, worth putting in the history books next to the generals and the presidents. His legacy is still alive today. CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center in Mexico, continues the work he helped establish, developing new wheat and maize varieties for the developing world. The Norman Borlaug Institute for International Agriculture at Texas A&M carries on his mission. The World Food Prize, which he helped found in 1986 as a way to honor contributions to food security, something he felt was missing from the Nobel category structure, awards distinguished scientists and policymakers each year in Des Moines, Iowa. He came from Iowa, and he made sure the legacy came back there. I want to close with something that I think explains, better than anything else, who Norman Borlaug was. Late in his life, he was asked how he would like to be remembered. He could have said, as the man who saved 1 billion lives, as the man who ended famine in India, as a Nobel laureate. Instead, he gave an answer that sounded more like something his wrestling coach, Dave Bartleman, might have said back in Minnesota decades before. He said he hoped to be remembered as someone who had done something useful in his time on Earth. That was it. Something useful. A man who bent the course of human history, and what he wanted for his epitaph was, he did something useful. Here's what I want to ask you, and I genuinely love your answer in the comments. Is Norman Borlaug's name taught in your school? Did your history class, your science class, your social studies class, did any of it ever mention the Green Revolution in a way that connected it to a specific person, to a specific farm in Iowa, to a specific fungus in a specific Mexican field? Because I have a feeling the answer for most of you is no. And if I'm right about that, I'd love to know what you think that says about the stories we choose to tell ourselves about who we are and what we've contributed to the world. Drop it in the comments. If this story moved you, share it with someone who you think would appreciate it. These are the stories that deserve to travel. If you want more American history that never made it into your textbooks, subscribe and hit the bell. I'll see you in the next one.